Seeing Both Sides of the Controversy Regarding Supervised Injection Sites by Robert Sweeney for ADC 655 at Aspen University. Since the 1960s, substance abuse and addiction have become such a prevalent issue in American life. The people in positions of authority who would have hidden their personal or family issues in the past now use them to justify support or decry policy related to treatment. Policies regarding supervised injection sites are particularly prone to this phenomenon because the topic touches core beliefs people hold regarding treatment, addiction, the role of government, public policy, and research. This presentation will look at the two sides of the controversy around three perspectives. First, is harm reduction the obvious reason for a supervised injection site in and of itself a good idea? Do those sites that have been established actually deliver on their promises to reduce harm? And are there legitimate side effects or unintended consequences that need to be considered that would either increase the value of those sites or decrease them to the community at large? Supervised injection sites are a natural development from the syringe exchange movement in the 1980s, a time when there was an increase in HIV infection as well as an increase in syringes in the use of injected drugs. And as a response to that particular issue, people would start exchanging dirty needles that they had been sharing with others and spreading infection for clean needles at these sharing sites. Harm reduction in that instance made the most sense because what you were doing was reducing the level of infection by not worrying about whether or not they were addicted, whether or not they were using, but just exchanging needles so that you knew that at least that part of the process of becoming infected was being interrupted and people were reducing the number of infection. For harm reduction itself, the concept is that you do that, you reduce harm rather than worrying about the overall problem, and then that way you at least help people, you save lives, and you at least approach the problem from some perspective rather than ignoring the whole thing. In the 21st century, now that we've got issues with the severity of the drug itself, the drugs themselves have become more dangerous, as well as the infections that are being transferred by sharing needles. It's not just a matter of making sure people can exchange clean needles for the dirty ones. They have to be monitored when they use, because from one dose to the next, you don't know what's in the needle. From one day to the next, you don't know what your tolerance is. People are dying by accident in ways that they never did before. Another goal of a supervised injection site is that in addition to the medical professionals you have on site are social workers and housing workers, people who would normally provide services to those who are in the most likely populations to use these drugs. And these sites, having those people on site, allows them to connect with those users who need those other kinds of ancillary services, potentially giving them the tools they need to get away from addiction in general, but meeting them where they're at the point where they need the help that they feel they need at the moment, and then attacking the overall lifestyle problem, sort of from an ancillary team approach as opposed to a heavy-handed, over-the-top, this is how you have to live your life way. By creating these safe havens at these sites, you hopefully will reduce the kinds of crimes that are associated with places where people go and pick up and use drugs. Things like dirty needles or vagrancy or petty theft, they would hope would be improved by setting up these sites in those locations. What we found by talking to police officers in areas where they have supervised injection sites is that to some degree, there are fewer interactions with police and fewer interactions with emergency services in general. And in particular, we're not seeing the same kinds of emergency overdose related kinds of things that we had in those areas before those sites were put in place. Regarding overdoses specifically, there has only been one instance of an overdose on a supervised injection site that I could find, and it was actually a suicide attempt at a program called Insight in Vancouver in 2012. Since that time, there have been no documented overdoses at supervised injection sites. And in Vancouver, the large city, which only had one site at the time, when I could see my statistics up to 2016, there had been an overall reduction in overdose deaths by 9%. Meanwhile, overdose deaths in America, where there are no supervised injection sites that are allowed by government, we've seen an increase in overdose deaths from 40,000 in 2012 to over 60,000 in 2016. There are only supervised injection sites that are sanctioned by the government in Canada. So the statistics that we have are limited pretty much to those sites. But what we found is that for every dollar spent on those programs, there's a savings of at least $7 in medical services that have not required provision because the number of emergencies have been reduced. We're also seeing an economic boost in that those people who get jobs, get housing, get off the street, start to kick their addiction and get back into life the way they wanted to. You see an actual increase in economic output from those individuals such that your savings goes from 7 to 1 to 10 to 1. And you're helping people save their lives. So as a natural response or natural outgrowth of seeing that happen in Canada, there are unsanctioned sites now opening across America in places like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Seattle. While we have no real legitimate statistics we can look at, it seems they are making a useful attempt to help people in the community. On the other side of the argument, harm reduction itself is viewed as a social band-aid. It's not actually treatment. You're just taking care of a small part of the problem that is actually identified by the user as opposed to identified by the community. And the community doesn't believe that this is healthy or ethical behavior. So why are we allowing the behavior to happen? And by doing this, we're creating a program where those programs that do have some effect are losing their funding because you're spreading it over a wider area of treatment. When you're looking at other programs that people could get attached to but haven't, you start increasing the costs in those programs when people start to take advantage of things like housing and medical assistance that governments are trying to get rid of in their entirety. So why would I create a welfare system taking care of people if I'm trying to get rid of welfare in itself? And then the argument is that because you can't track what people are doing with the needles, you're actually increasing the opportunity for demand. An individual can become even more addicted because you're making it less risky for him to use. But the most important issue is that it reduces the power and impact of law enforcement. If it is illegal to use and you set up a site where in this place it's a safe haven to use, then what does the law mean? Again, looking at the statistics, did you just increase the demand? And the big problem we have is that at sites like this, you cannot have accurate statistics on what demand you're creating, what demand you're reducing, because of the issues with confidentiality. If you have very tightly controlled statistics and you look at everybody coming in and out the door, no one's going to want to come there because of the stigma attached with drugs, and it's still an illegal activity. So looking at the statistics, when I said there was a 9% decrease in Vancouver, a lot of people look at that number and say it's just not a very big drop in the number of overdose deaths, and there are still thousands of people dying. And that drop may be attributed to better law enforcement or better drug and alcohol treatment and other programs. This particular intervention may not be the reason that people are surviving. As far as side effects, when you start putting a program like this in a poor area, the argument is that you've created a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, and that the poor area has facilities for the poor. You keep them in the poor, in the slums, and then there's no reason for that area to ever become better than it is in the past. If, on the other hand, you move these programs to high-value areas in the suburban sections where those people who use those facilities have no jobs that would match the area where you're at, they end up becoming vagrants and squatters because the jobs they have can't possibly get them into that high-rent district close enough to that facility to take advantage of it. One of the things people point out is that the surveys in the general population show a strong support for these kinds of sites, but when you try to locate one into any neighborhood, there's a huge protest. It's a very difficult thing to create a new one. So is the support real, or is that just something that people become very vocal about when it's an abstract idea? And abstract ideas are one of the major problems, that while statistics show that there's little or reduced crime, or little change or reduced crime in any of the areas where they've set these programs up, the perception is crime has actually increased. People don't feel safe when there is a location where people can inject drugs safely. And harm reduction as a concept creates a controversy all of its own that people argue take away from those programs that actually solve the issue with substance abuse and addiction. It's taking away from those people who need to go to AA because you're spending a lot of your time arguing over whether safe injection is a good idea. So on the pro side, we actually do reduce deaths. We do reduce disease contamination. We don't know how much, but we know it is a reduction in those harms. And we do increase referrals to services that are in place and can help people by getting them attached to those programs. We do increase support for clients, peer-to-peer as well as professional-to-peer, and we do decrease the stigma of using these kinds of medications, these kinds of drugs in these ways by attaching them to programs that are not viewed as such a horrible place to be. And at least some help is better than none at all. On the other side, this kind of help can reduce the effectiveness of other interventions. It's less of an improvement than initially promised in literature, and you do lower the property values of those areas close to those kinds of facilities because of the stigma attached to it. And this creates a discord among people who all want to help the problem rather than creating a cooperation. And that's based on the concept that this is probably a misguided central thesis. Thank you very much.